sort of caregiver. It can be something very mild where they might just need someone once a week to take care of a few tasks for them. And it can go all the way to very severe where someone needs multiple caregivers to care for them for their entire life. So if you're thinking that 25% have a disability, many, many more people in the millions are in the caregiver category. And those caregivers, they need help, they need support, and that's what we're here for. So let's go on to see the next statistic. 1 in 3 Americans with disabilities don't have health care, and 1 in 3 Americans with disabilities have a job. So here you see a big financial discrepancy. You see medical bills piling up, you see cost of living bills piling up, and that is stressful for the person with a disability, but that also causes a lot of stress and anxiety for their caregiver, who is, a lot of times financially supporting them as well. And then if we look at our specific Muslim demographic, we have over 600,000 Muslims in America with a disability. Again, I keep saying this over and over, but many of you may be shocked and surprised by this number, just because we don't see these people in our community as much, but they do exist, and that means that Muslim caregiver pool is huge. And remember, we want to strengthen our community. We want to support these people. Need support emotionally, financially, spiritually. I'm not going to even hit all of the categories, but that's what we're here to talk about, is like, how do we support these caregivers? And then who does disability affect? So obviously it affects the individual, but that individual lives usually with a family who's their direct caregiver. So it affects their family, it affects their way of life. And then that family is part of a community. So we don't always think about, like that far reach of disability, but you have to kind of understand that connection, right? Like, it's not just this one person going through something, their family's going through it. And as a community, we should all be feeling this pain. As a Muslim Ummah, we want to all support each other. We want to be strong. Like, we have to support everyone in our community. So how do we do that? We have to elevate the conversation. We have to educate each other, and we have to all support each other. Members of the community can be caregivers too, to give parents and families a break. So these are all different ways we're tied together, connected, and can support each other. Okay, then there's different types of self-care. So I don't know if many of you know about this, but there's different categories, okay? So one is physical. So that's just taking care of your physical body, getting enough sleep, getting exercise, feeling good, feeling rested. If you're tired all the time, it's hard to take care of another person. There's emotional self-care, like that stress management, that anxiety you feel, the compassion towards another person. All of that needs to be aligned and in a good place before you can take care of someone else. There's social self-care. This is a really important one, to have that social support, to have, the support system in the community, in your family, someone who can step in and help out. Just having communication and being able to ask for help, that's part of social self-care. Like, many people don't want to ask others for help. They want to, kind of almost protect other people by not asking them. They want to take on all the burden on themselves. So make sure you feel comfortable with this part of self-care where you can ask people for help, and they probably do want to help you. And then there's the spiritual self-care. So do you have just time alone? Do you have time to, pray, meditate, have a connection with nature? All of those things, they help ground you. They help give you the peace that you need. Again, you need that to take care of someone else. So that's why all 4 of these are really important. Then we can talk a little bit about caregiver burnout. But before we even talk about burnout, let's talk about what is a caregiver, okay? So if you're listening right now, maybe you are a caregiver, or you know someone who's a caregiver, or you're even just thinking about like how to just mentally take care of yourself, different types of self-care. So a caregiver is an unpaid individual. So an example is a spouse, partner, family member, friend, neighbor, who's involved in assisting others with activities of daily living or medical tasks. That's what a caregiver is. Caregiver burnout, when you're not getting enough help, or you're not addressing all those 4 types of self-care that I talked about in the previous slide, can lead to many of these feelings that are listed on the slide, like stress, anxiety, fatigue. All of these things are really valid feelings that a lot of caregivers feel. I mean, these are very real, I can tell you. So this is what we want to avoid, right? Like, we want to do the 4 types of self-care in the previous slide, so we avoid getting to the stage of caregiver burnout. Okay, so I'm gonna get ready to move into the panel discussion now. So remember that if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat box and I'm going to try to get to them as much as I possibly can. And this is that resource slide that I had promised you. So if you have a phone with you, go ahead and take a picture of this. If you have a pencil, jot something down. This actually will be emailed to all the registered participants. And I will put it up again at the very end of our talk. So if you didn't get to see the whole thing, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and I'll give you a second to go ahead and grab a picture of that now. We have Project Taqwa on here, Khalil Center. So these are counseling resources, things like that, support resources that can help caregivers and who are feeling that burnout feeling. And remember to stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, stay sane. And if you cannot, ask us for help. That's why we're here. Okay, so I'm just going to start with some introductions for our panelists. I'll just quickly introduce myself first. I'm Hana Khan. I am the operations manager at Muhsen, and as I mentioned, we are a nonprofit organization who supports our brothers and sisters with special needs across the country. We are nationwide, and we do that through education, weekend school programs, and different kind of awareness, youth training. We also have support groups for caregivers. So if you are a caregiver of someone with a disability, please go to our website, muhsen.org, and you can join one of our support groups. And besides that, I am also a mother to a child with autism. So I am a caregiver. I'm a full-time caregiver. So I can certainly relate to many of these items that we're going to talk about today, and I can give my perspective on that as well. And that being said, I will pass it off to Muhsen's spiritual lead, Shaykh Tariq, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is a pleasure to be here with each and every single one of you. My name is Tariq Musleh. I am a youth director and associate imam at the Mecca Center in Willowbrook, Illinois. But beyond that, I've also had the pleasure of working with Muhsen, leading Umrah groups, having the honor of speaking at some of the conventions that we have for the Muslim community. But most importantly, I've had the opportunity to serve people with special needs and their families. I am a hardcore Starbucks addict. It's a problem. I have to have my coffee every day. So Ramadan is a challenge. I also have family members with special needs, and they are, subhanAllah, some of the greatest inspirations in my life, them and their caregivers. So I'm excited to be here with you and happy to be a part of this discussion, inshallah ta'ala.
Thank you so much, Shaykh Tariq. We also have with us today a marriage and family therapist, Sister Masumeh. Sister Masumeh, do you want to go ahead and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. I'm really happy to be joining this conversation. It's a really important conversation. So a little bit about who I am and how maybe I can provide some resource to this conversation. I'm a recent graduate in marriage and family therapy, so I'm a resident. Becoming a fully licensed marriage and family therapist is a 5-year trek, so I'm done with 3 of those. But I've actually been working with families with disability from various perspectives and roles for about 20 years as a behavior therapist and as an educational interventionist and as a community-based crisis interventionist. So I've understood or come to understand disability from a lot of different angles as a mental health worker, but also I have some personal intersections with disability, both with my family and my personal life, so I understand it from the inside out as well. In my graduate studies, my thesis was a qualitative research, interviewing parents and emerging adult children with disability about their experience in the launching stage of the family life cycle. So that's a special interest of mine, and I love working with families that are experiencing chronic illness, disability, and just from a resilience perspective. So I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. Thank you, both of you, for being here today. I am really excited to hear your expertise today. So let's just go on to the panel discussion. So just so you all know how this is going to work, we have a couple of different scenarios which different types of caregivers can relate to. So I'm going to read off a scenario, and then the panelists can feel free to jump in and respond to these, okay? So scenario 1, I'll go ahead and start reading that. As a single mother, it has been difficult taking care of my son, Ahmed, with autism. My husband left me months after he was diagnosed with his condition. At 17, as Ahmed nears adulthood, I am afraid for his future. Obviously, the love I have for Ahmed cannot be put into words, and I cannot help but wonder what his life will be like when I am gone. As an adult, how will he take care of himself when I no longer can? Because of this fear, I secretly desire him to pass away before me, not being able to bear the idea of Ahmed being left alone. How can I overcome this fear and come to terms with this realistically, emotionally? And before the panelists jump in on this, I actually want to make a comment because as a mother, I can relate to this so much. I can feel the emotions of this person jumping out at me, the worry, the anxiety. This is such a real feeling for so many caregivers. And there's two important topics here that I really want the panelists to hit. One is the single mother or single parent factor of kind of like raising this person alone, and also that feeling of what this person is going to need care well after I'm gone, and how do you deal with those types of emotions? So do either of you kind of want to jump in on that?
Go for it, Sister Masum.
Yeah. There's so much there, right? Because, I mean, the first thing that honestly comes to mind is social isolation, which is something that was mentioned in one of the slides in your information presentation portion of this discussion. It's unfortunate that the people who need the most support in our society often receive the least. And part of that is society not knowing how to relate to them. We have a lot of like dominant social narratives around what a typical body is, what a typical life looks like, what typical launching looks like. And it's quite, it's not even the majority of people who have that scenario, because if you look at statistically in America, actually more than half of adults have some kind of chronic illness. So I think there's a lot of myth busting that needs to go on in terms of how we understand health and relate to each other over health issues. But for this single mom, the single moms in my study were by far much more experienced much more caregiver strain than the mothers who were partnered. And part of it is that they don't have their partner's support for themselves. So even though they might, like a single mom and a mom who's partnered might both be giving the same kind of care, they might both be full-time work and also full-time caregivers. But at the end of the day, the single mom doesn't have anybody patting her on the back and saying, you did such a wonderful job, even though the house was a wreck, even though the kid had a tantrum, even though so many things, you are doing such a wonderful job. The single mom just doesn't get that reassurance and that emotional support for herself from her partner. Whereas the mom who's partnered, generally at the end of the day, there's somebody saying, thank God you did this. And I could go to work and I could do this and I could do that. And I could come home and pitch in as much as I could, but like, thank you for keeping this ship floating. And so they don't really, there's a huge difference in social support just in terms of not having a partner, not having a life partner. And then out in society, especially in certain societies where there's stigma against being a single mom to begin with, there's stigma against divorce, there's already a social disconnect. They're already kind of having less opportunity for social resource and social support. And then they have a situation that other people might not feel comfortable relating to, like, how do I have a play date with your son? How do I have a dinner at your house? And it's just a matter of actually trying and working it out, because it's not hard to learn how to relate to someone with a child with autism, but it's something that there's stigma and there's misconceptions and there's a lot of social ice around. So yeah, we have a long way to go to be able to really say that we are embracing single moms who have at all, but single moms who have children with serious caregiving needs, where they need respite and the mom needs support. She shouldn't be feeling like when I'm gone, my son has no one, because there should be the uncle, the aunt, the cousin, there should be so many more people involved in caregiving to begin with. And unfortunately, that doesn't always happen for a variety of reasons. And this is something we're, definitely being in therapy, one of the things we work on with families is getting them social support outside of the therapy. Like, how do you build that network around your child so that it's not all about you and what you can give the child? I don't know if that answered it.
No, it definitely does. I mean, for me, I think when I see the word single mother, I think of so much of what you talked about, Sister Masumeh, Allah bless you. You hit a lot of strong points. And I think a lot of times single mothers are searching for that validity, that validation, that, I'm doing something right, or at the very least, I'm trying my best. And if there's one thing that I really want, myself first and foremost, and all the single mothers out there to do is really ask yourself or question where we're trying to get our validation from, right? And the reality is we all need human validation, and it's something that's so critically important. But let it be known that you being a single mother does not make you any less of a mother, and that a person being a caregiver, and particularly a single caregiver, it actually higher their status with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because it means that they're doing more work. And this is not something to shy away from. There were prophets of Allah whose mothers were single mothers. And that is not haphazard, and that is not by accident. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does that, and He does everything that He does, subhanAllah. He does it with perfection and with precision. And so when you find that Isa alayhi salam, right, Jesus is the son of a single mother, there is something so beautiful and profound there. And when you see her asking, what are people going to say? That is exactly the concern of so many single mothers out there. So the idea or the message that I really want to draw is that your validation, my dear sister or single mother out there, and even all of us really, is let us find our validity and our validation from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And what that means is taking the time to see what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says about me to me. What does He say about me to me? And that's opening the Quran and hearing the narrative of Musa alayhi salam, a mother that is fleeing and worried about her child and placing him in a basket to flow into the river by the command of Allah. And she and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes her feelings, yet Allah validates her feelings. Hajar, running between two mountains after being left alone with her son in the middle of the desert, searching frantically for water, the same way that so many mothers are searching frantically for the type of support and care. She's going from mountaintop to mountaintop, looking for some type of sustenance, some type of nourishment, some type of comfort. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the water of Zamzam that we continue to drink from till today. This is Allah's care for mothers. This is Allah's care for parents that are trying to support their children with special needs. So the last point, so number one is, let us contextualize where we get our validity from. And number two is with this concern of, subhanAllah, if there's one thing that I observed, Sister Hannah and Sister Masumeh, about people with special needs and their families, is that they have the courage and the bravery and the audacity to think beyond the norms. So you'll find them saying, how is my child going to take care of themselves after my death? Thinking about their own death in such a real way, in such a raw way. And so the point that I want to draw there is that the same Allah who brought them to you, the same Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that instilled within you the strength, that when you say, I'm about to give up on myself, I have no more energy, I have no more resources, I don't know how I'm going to get by, I don't know how I'm going to get them to school. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala opens doors of hope that you never imagined where they could come from. That same Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will open doors at that time. So it's about finding avenues of hope. And there are so many avenues of hope. This conversation right here is an avenue of hope provided to us by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Organizations like Project Taqwa, organizations like Muhsen, individuals like Sister Hannah and Sister Masumeh, people like the ones that are in this group, these are avenues of hope that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives to us. So rather than looking so far ahead where you cannot see the light, look for the light that Allah has surrounded you with today. And know that just as Allah has given you avenues of light and hope today, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will provide those for you. So sometimes the greatest way to overcome that fear is to find the hope that exists within you today, and to know that the same one that provided you that hope today will give it to you in the future. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give comfort and strength and resilience, like Sister Masumeh mentioned, to all of the single mothers that are out there, inshallah ta'ala.
Okay, Shaykh Tariq, that gave me chills. That was an amazing answer. I mean, just even the example of the mothers, I mean, I could really relate to a lot of those emotions that they were going through. And as a person who certainly, you know, thinks about my own death in such a real way, like you said, I mean, that really is such a great response, because there are times I just think like, oh my gosh, I'm so tired. I'm like just done with this life. And at the same time, I need to live to like 120. So thank you for that answer. That is really, you know, hit the nail on the head. So, okay. So shall we go on to the next one, or did you guys have any other comments on this?
Go for it. There's
all right.
More.
There is more. Okay. So scenario number 2, Asad has 2 children with special needs. His son has autism and his daughter has dyslexia. During COVID, it has been hard to manage both of their online schoolwork and making sure they do not regress. Asad feels like he is their new teacher. He spends all day teaching them and all night prepping for the next day. He has no time to do anything for himself, and it is a lot to manage both of their different work. How can he manage his own time and the kids' work? And I'd love to hear the answer on this, because I'm actually going through this exact scenario too. So we just started our e-learning this week, and I have 2 kids at 2 very different levels, and I work full time from home. So we're teachers, we're employees. So yeah, how do we navigate something like this? Does anyone want to jump in?
Yeah, that's tough, right?
Yeah.
Because there's 24 hours in a day, no matter how many people are relying on you and how many tasks you have to do. So, yeah, I think one thing I want to say, I think this is a good place to just talk about self-care.
Yeah, definitely.
Because I can see burnout like already in this scenario. And once you burn out, like you start to have your own health problems. You start to become emotionally unavailable to the very people that you're trying to prioritize. And, you know, even spiritually, I think Shaykh Tariq, you can probably talk to this, like that point of being so burnt out of all your like mental, emotional resources feel spent. So I think this is a good chance to jump in and say, like, self-care is really important. And sometimes good enough is way more than enough in terms of the things that you feel pressured to perform about. Right now we're in a pandemic, and hopefully we won't always be in a pandemic. There's different kinds of gains that we can all have and glean from this period of our lives as families, as individuals. It's not going to look the same as if we are not in a pandemic, and we shouldn't have those kinds of expectations of ourselves that that I will see no regression in my children with special needs. I will do all their all their educational prep, and it will just keep flowing as if you're not also in a pandemic, as if you haven't just lost all this, like most of the structure and resources from your lives and your child's lives. So to be more realistic with ourselves and more compassionate with ourselves, and really take the time to show ourselves compassion through self-care. That's great modeling for your children. That will make you much more effective and emotionally available to your children, so that you can actually, as a family, make the most out of this period of time. This is a time to find out who we are in terms of our resilience as families. This is a time to show how much we are there for each other, and how much, no matter how the world is falling apart, we are still a whole family, and we are still a strong family, and a family that just loves and takes care of each other. Whether that looks like amazing educational gains or no educational gains. The most important thing right now is that feeling of wholeness as a family, and that feeling of connection as a family, that feeling of compassion for yourself and your children, to get through this crisis, this pandemic. So just to kind of like take a lot of that off of yourselves. personally as a mom, like we've homeschooled before and for various reasons, and it looks different. It looks different. Sometimes it looks like today what we learned is how to clean the house together. And that's a great life skill. You know, today what we learned is how to self-care together. We're all going to choose the movie everybody likes, and we're going to sit here and just have some fun, or, you know, we're going to learn how to call it quits and when to take a break. You know, so those are important life skills. It's not all about getting through chapter 2 in algebra today. You know, there's bigger things happening.
I can't get through chapter 2 of algebra.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's such a great point. Like, as a parent, you know, to just stop putting all that pressure on yourself. Like, they need to read this chapter, they need to finish this assignment, and they need to like log in at this time. And like you said, just take time to build yourself, build up your other skills. I think this is actually, you know, a great time for that. It's like a time where the world has slowed down. All kids are going to be a little bit, you know, behind, or whatever you want to call it. Like, no one's, you know, doing this great, excellent job of like reading chapter 2 or whatever. So it is a good time to kind of like stop, build up your self-confidence, build up your other skills, so that when it is time to go back to school, you're kind of like ready with like this new, you know, confidence you were able to build in other skills at home. Maybe that's a good way to look at it.
I mean, I think also, if I may, I would say that, like, what's interesting is when you study the life of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you'll find him practicing self-care, and it's a really, really beautiful sight to see. You find that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam used to retreat to the cave of Hira even before prophethood, and he would go and he would retreat there and reflect and contemplate and talk to God, observe himself, reflect on his own actions, observe his society, question what they're doing, if it's good, if it's not good. And so you find the greatest of creation that ever lived on this earth taking the time to be alone, to be vulnerable with himself, and to actually process his own emotions and experiences. Brothers and sisters, if the Prophet of Allah needed to do that, then what is it that allows you and I to think that we can get away without doing it? And so this is a prophetic tradition. The ability to just disconnect from our phones, disconnect from our computers, disconnect from our laptops, frankly speaking, disconnect from the people around us for a little bit, set some me time, and just sit alone and be with ourselves and think about what we're going through. If that means taking your heart and pouring it out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I remember a sister came to me, and she's been the caregiver for her child with special needs for like 2 decades. And she says, I want to talk to Allah, but it takes so much work. I have to make wudu, I have to put on hijab, I have to find my janamas, I have to lay it all out, and then I can make dua. And I'm like, who told you have to do all of that? When Allah talks about how we talk to him and spend time with him in the Quran, he says those who remember Allah standing and sitting, laying on their sides. Like, you can just be laying on your bed and talking to Allah, being alone with yourself, but in the company of God and processing everything that you're doing. This is something that's so critical. And you know what's beautiful is how it talked about the need, the scenario talked about the need to manage your own time. Brothers and sisters, we are, as one of my teachers said, we are like a well. A well can be a source of water and life to everything around it. But if a well is far too empty, then it can become a hazard for people to fall into. You need to make sure that your well is constantly filled with goodness, so you can continue to provide nourishment and care. But if you are not taking care of your own wellness, you see what I did there? Well and wellness. It's an attempt. It didn't.
I like it.
Thank you for your sister. But the idea there is, if our wells of self-care are not full, we will not be able to provide that wellness. So taking time to be alone, taking time to go for a walk, taking the time to process our own emotions and experiences, these are things that are so critical. I also want to point out something, if it's okay. I love that this scenario, it talks about a father. It says Asad has 2 children. Our community needs to call out a problem or an issue when it's there, which is that for far too long, fathers have said that they are babysitting their children. instead of just being fathers to their children. And so I love the image that's depicted here, which is that fathers are equally parents to their children. And we have a serious issue when fathers are abandoning their children, distancing themselves from their children, and not being responsible for the care of their children who are typical or those with special needs. And so we need to be able to say that part of self-care is communicating to our partners or our former partners, our, the co-parents of our children, that listen, I need to take care of myself too. And this child is as much your child and as much dependent on you as they are dependent on me. So part of self-care is self-advocating, advocating for your rights to take care of yourself. Not because you're being selfish in an evil way, but because you being selfish sometimes to take care of yourself will allow you to be a better parent for the child that you're so worried about and concerned about.
Exactly. And Shaykh Tariq, that's actually gives me a perfect transition to a question that we had from the audience, which also kind of ties into the first scenario we had with the single mother and kind of the topic you were just talking about. So let me just read out this question to you guys. Why are men in general and men in our culture less accepting of disability in children, leaving a high percentage of single mothers of children with disabilities? What can we do to bring disability acceptance to husbands and brothers and sons who will grow up to be fathers? So I think you sort of addressed that a little bit, but yeah, I think we should just expand on that a little bit. Like, how do we get that acceptance from, the male demographic in our culture?
Shaykh Tariq, I think this is maybe like a little more.
I'm gonna get too worked up, so I think it's best.
Get worked up, come on.
No, because here's the thing.
Channel it.
Sister Masumeh's like, someone bring the popcorn because it's about to get. No, I'm gonna keep. This is a positive conversation, so we want to keep it positive, inshallah ta'ala. I think we need to revisit what fatherhood looks like. I think in many cultures, across the world, really, there's this image of the father being the one who's putting food on the table, quote unquote, and putting a roof over the head. And what you find, again, we just have to look back at the prophetic examples. Really just visiting the prophets and the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You'll see the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam after the death of Khadija, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was a single dad taking care of his children. People don't talk about that. And you find that one of the sahabiyat, one of the female companions, she found the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam sitting at his doorstep, and she built up the courage, and she went up to him. She says, "Why don't you get married so you have someone to help you with your children and help you with your household?" And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he looked at her and he said, "Man ba'da Khadija?" Who is it that could come and take the place of Khadija? Because of how much of a partner she was in life, how they shared everything. They fed the poor together. They helped the needy together. They took care of their children together. They raised a family together. They adopted children together. And they provided for the poor and the needy and advocated for the rights of Black slaves together. You know what I mean? So that is the dynamic of a healthy relationship that calls on the man to be so forthcoming that you find Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha saying that he used to clean the house just like any other person should. He used to help at home just like any other person should. And so we need to revisit what it means to be a father. It doesn't just mean to fill the bank account. It means to fill the home with happiness, to fill the home with activities, to fill the home with healthy conversations. And I think that for far too long, our community went as far as, and I apologize for saying this, blaming the mother for a child with special needs and any deficiencies and any issues. And that needs to be completely transformed into saying that this is not a blame game. This is not a fault trip. This is us saying, this is a journey that we started together, whether it is a marriage or what have you. And this is something that we will continue to do. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, you find him saying that the best of you are those that are best to their families. that is an unconditional statement. That is one that doesn't say when everything looks good and when everything is right. It says that when we are best to our families, when circumstances are not best, that is when we become the best people in the eyes of God. When things aren't the way that we expect them, but we continue to be best to our families, that is when we become best in the eyes of God, right? So again, I want to keep the conversation positive, but really saying that we need to change the conversation. That fathers take ownership, myself first and foremost, and all the fathers out there take ownership of the raising of their children and the participation in their life, the love and the care that's needed. And even if the marriage is no longer intact, that doesn't make you any less of a father to the child that you have. It rather, it obligates us to be even more present, inshallah.
Thank you. That is perfectly said, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know, Sister Masumeh, did you have something?
Definitely. Yeah, no, I love that. And I love the fact that it sounds like there's not only the passion about the issue, but the intimate familiarity with like how this sometimes plays out in our community. I can say, like, broader than the Muslim community, that there are some kinds of unique dynamics that can emerge between a couple when they have a child with a special need or a child with a disability, especially if it's a developmental disability, and particularly if there's externalizing behaviors, which is like a term for basically being aggressive to other people, that looks a little different, right, than partnership and marriage and child rearing and co-parenting with a typically developing child. But it is a myth that there's more divorce or paternal abandonment of children with in families of children with developmental disability. It kind of depends on the scenario. It just there is a lot of divorce of families with children. that's actually kind of, there's a certain age of a child in a family where there's a particular strain on the marriage. But one of the dynamics that we see a lot with couples who have a child with a disability that requires a lot of caregiving, and not only caregiving, like feeding, clothing, educating, protecting, but caregiving that's specialized medically or specialized behaviorally, that one of the partners tends to become the expert in how to cope with that child's symptoms. And the other parent tends to withdraw. And sort of you have this over-functioner parent who's the expert and this under-functioning parent who's sort of backing away from the situation. And then the over-functioning parent turns into the only caregiver for that child, even if the other parent is doing other things. Like maybe they'll clean the house too, or they'll give rides to the other kids or give love to the other kids and care to the other kids. But that special needs child becomes extremely bonded to the parent who starts to develop the expertise in how to manage their behaviors and their symptoms and their caregiving. And this is a really destructive dynamic that as family therapists, we try to intervene and let the parent who's over-functioning start to trust the parent who's under-functioning, so that there isn't this polarization around the relationship. So I don't know if that's helpful, but basically there's two parts to that, right? There's the person pulling away. There's also the other partner pushing them away a little bit. Like, this is very sacred territory. You can't child the way I can take care of this child, so just back off. And that's a dynamic with on a family level, and I think on a community level, like empowering the often father to know how to manage those things, those specialized caregiving needs. Parental involvement, father involvement in child caretaking for children with special needs is inversely related to maternal depression. So, and maternal depression is directly correlated with child symptoms. So and we see this with this over-functioning, under-functioning pattern. Once that starts and once that gets into play and it gets more and more polarized, we see maternal burnout, we see maternal depression, then we see the child suffering a lot in their symptoms because that caregiver is actually emotionally unavailable. And then, and so the intervention is actually father involvement, because once the father gets involved in caretaking for that child, the maternal depression resolves. She can return to being sort of like her whole person and more available to her partner as well. And that has different, outcomes for their marriage. So I don't know if that got too technical, but there is a way. There are dynamics that we've seen, like in family science. We've mapped these out. This is really well studied, and there are interventions for this. If you're in a dynamic like that, I really recommend this book, Married with Special Needs Children. It's based on like hundreds of qualitative interviews, and it's written by a family therapist who specializes in this. So there's a lot of ways to get around these scenarios, these dynamics, and like de-escalate what's happened, and plug back into your family if you're feeling like I can't fix this. And so, I mean, I want to empathize with the fathers too. That is a responsibility, but it's also a lot of fathers feel like very frustrated. They feel more anger than the mother around the symptom, around the diagnosis. They feel less what we call resolution, which is basically accepting the diagnosis. And part of it is this feeling that like, did I do this? It's a narcissistic wound, right? Like, is this my fault? Is this child's problem because I did a sin? Is this child's problem because I'm not capable of fixing my family? And it's so hard on fathers, right? So, and that it's unspeakable for them to get those words out, to get those feelings out. Well, once they do, their partner can support them, the therapy can support them, and they can work through it. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you for that. And maybe we can,
those are
what's
great.
that?
So we're benefiting a lot, mashallah. I think that you're absolutely right. I think a lot of fathers back away because they don't I feel like they're typically problem solvers and they find themselves in a predicament that they cannot solve. So empathizing with them and then giving them direction as to where to go is something that's so critical.
Mm-hmm.
You were saying something, Sister Hannah, I apologize.
Oh, I was just going to say, let's drop the name of that book into the chat box in case if anyone wants to pick it up. That sounds like a good read. So
I'll write the title here.
Okay, so that's actually a great topic, but let's go on to the next scenario. Scenario 3. My daughter, Sarah, is 35 years old and she has cerebral palsy. Now that she's 35 years old, there's no school, job, or day program she can attend, so that my husband and I have to take care of her 24/7. We both had to stop working, and all of our friends stopped inviting us over because we could never come anyway. Although we love her unconditionally, we feel like we have no purpose in life other than to watch over Sarah. What can we do to overcome this lack of direction in life? I think that's such a great question, because I think a lot of us just get so wrapped up in caregiving, we forget everything about ourselves. Like, we lose a part of our own identity when we're doing that. Even for myself, I know like there's so many activities I used to enjoy before that I just don't have time for anymore. When you're taking care of someone else, you sometimes have to drop those things. So what do you guys think about that?
Yeah. Well, I'll jump in from a family systems perspective and just kind of take a guess that this is a very enmeshed family, that they're very close, and that's a strength, as well as that double-edged sword of like, this is our strength, and also this kind of trips us up in some kind of functioning ways as a family, because it sounds like this family is really being there for each other, which is that kind of family cohesion. That's a strength and a gain that a lot of families get from having an individual with disability. Echoing kind of back to our last conversation, there's actually something called the Down syndrome advantage of couples who have a child with Down syndrome tend not to get divorced. And part of it is the joy that this person brings to their life, and part of it is the cohesion. So there is like this kind of special cocoon that can form around families of a person with developmental disability or disability that requires especially more and more care over time, like cerebral palsy, where they know that in the back of their minds there's kind of a clock ticking, and they don't have all the time in the world with this person. And so other people are just not as important. Other relationships are just not as important. And yet they need that that social functioning, those other social roles of being a friend and being an aunt and being a maybe a teacher in the community or something like that. So to kind of like acknowledge that cocoon is very comfortable and very wonderful, and also that it's possible to open it up a bit and have the relationships with others, that even if it means that you're going to visit somebody and you're not going all together as a family, that someone's going to be left behind sometimes, or someone's going to go alone sometimes, because families that are very enmeshed and kind of like they have their own little pod going on, they want to do everything together. And that's not always possible when you have somebody to take care of with a really serious condition like cerebral palsy. So that's kind of from a family systems perspective where I would guess reorganization could happen, and sort of like sort of encouraging more flexibility in the way they're getting together, so they don't lose, as they said, purpose in life and things like that.
I think that that's so critical. And I think that part of it is communicating it to the people that we want in our lives, right? So our friends, our family, our coworkers, the organizations or institutes where we want to be active, we should communicate. You know, I'm a part of a family with special needs. And so therefore, you know, let's have a conversation surrounding what I can bring to the table and what I can't bring to the table. And even discussing as a family, okay, we want to go on vacations. What does that look like? Or we want to go on the outings, and really adjusting and being comfortable with things not looking the way that we expected them to, or we wanted them to ideally, right? And realizing that just like, you know, this person with special needs might have brought a particular type of joy to our families, that they can also equally bring a particular type of creativity to our families. Creatively exploring what are different things that we can do that are fun that we would otherwise not do, you know, and so really, you know, thinking outside of the box and being comfortable, being vulnerable with people out there that we want to be a part of our lives. So a lot of times what happens, at least within the Muslim community, Sister Masumeh, is that if families have people with special needs in their in their homes, that they'll kind of begin to step away from their social circles, and they'll slowly close the blinds and close the doors, and not because they don't want to be engaged there, but because oftentimes what we find happening is that our community isn't well aware of those special needs, are not aware of how to accommodate for them. So because of that social awkwardness and that barrier, that ice that you spoke about earlier, the safer thing to do is just to distance ourselves. And so you go from going to a family gathering every month to going every 3 months, to going every 6 months, to going every year, to, hey, if I'm only seeing these people once a year, why is it worth it for me to even connect with them? So what that means is, you know, it's okay, like having conversations like, I have a child with special needs, you have a typical child, how can we have a play date together, like was alluded to earlier? I have a child with special needs, I still want to be a teacher in your institute, how can I actually still balance those two? And feeling the courage really to have those conversations where we can still have our purpose while fulfilling our purpose as a caregiver at the same time, inshallah.
Yeah, I love that. Like, I love everything you just said about particularly like creativity. Yeah.
Sister Hannah, you're a parent with special needs. Child, do you find that that parents kind of sometimes just close the social networks a little bit?
For sure, absolutely. Like we are pretty much like a split family. Either I go somewhere or my husband goes somewhere, and we kind of just take turns with that. But other than that, like that play date thing just really is so accurate, because as I meet new people, you know, they ask me, like, they want to get our kids together, and they ask me like, well, how old is your kid? And I have to say like, well, he's 8, but he's not really like an 8-year-old, you know what I mean? So it kind of forces you into that conversation, and so you almost just kind of like back away from it, like you don't even want. So then I'll just say like, oh yeah, I just have a 6-year-old, you know. Sometimes I just say that to be easier, because my 6-year-old's typical, and he can you know, look and act like a 6-year-old when they're on a play date. So it's just really awkward. It's like all these other people like, I have an 8-year-old. Oh, you have an 8-year-old, why don't you bring it? I'm like, oh, you guys know, maybe not really like that, you know. So that is definitely something that pushes me away from being social. And like I said, like it's very hard for us to go anywhere as a family. We really don't do that at all very much. So yeah, that's very, very accurate. So that being said, I'm going to try to squeeze in one more scenario before we have to wrap up, and maybe you guys can give us some quick responses on this one so that, you know, we can cover as much as possible. So scenario 4, Aisha is 18 years old and she will be starting college this year. Her twin brother Ali also finished high school this year, but he will not be able to attend college like Aisha will because of his intellectual disability. Aisha feels badly that her brother will not have the same opportunities as she does. She decides that she will not be playing basketball this season so that she can be home and spend some more time with Ali. She fears her new college life will take away from her being able to help out with Ali. How can Aisha be a normal college student without guilt while also still caring for her brother? I actually really love this question, and I wanted to get to it because, you know, like I just mentioned, I have 2 boys who are close in age, an 8-year-old with autism and a 6-year-old typical. And I could definitely see something like this being very realistic. I mean, my 6-year-old sacrifices a lot already. You know, and he always, you know, tries to include his brother, and he understands that, you know,
So beautiful, Masumeh.
that he has to sacrifice a lot sometimes, especially socially. So this is definitely a question I wanted to address. Like, how do you, you know, give the typical child as much of a normalcy as possible while still being part of this very different family?
Yeah, I feel like the word normal is very controversial anyway.
That's a good
So, so I just kind of throw that word out of my vocabulary for the most part, because it's basically like calling back to some dominant oppressive narratives around what you have to be in the world, and there's not a lot of room for what really exists in the world. If a sibling relationship looks different because one of the siblings functions in a different way in the world, that's okay. You know, I don't think that we have to fit anybody else's mold of what our lives will look like. I think that's really just those social comparisons cause a lot of depression for families with children who don't fit those molds. And it's really just, if you can free yourself from those social judgments and those kinds of words, I think it's really empowering. But this feeling of her feeling badly that her brother won't have the opportunities she does, I think that happens a lot in families with siblings where one of them is more typically developing and the other has, especially like a severe disability, an intellectual disability. There's almost like a survivor guilt for the sibling that doesn't have those things to deal with. There can be all kinds of reactions, right? Sometimes there's like a real pulling away, like I don't want to be associated with this. I see how the society views this person and I don't want to be associated. But sometimes they really saddle up to that sibling and become a strong advocate in their life, especially younger siblings of children with autism, like your kids. It's very, like a child with autism needs one person in this world that they can connect with emotionally. And often it's a younger sibling. Not usually an older sibling, not usually even necessarily a parent, but a younger sibling, because they have that period of seeing the other person in a nonverbal state. So they can make connections, emotional connections that are very, very powerful and last a lifetime. And so that is a relationship that's a strength and a resource for both people. I mean, we talk a lot about caregiving. Caregiving is it's a mutually, like there's mutuality in how that evolves and what that means. And there's a give and take. You get a lot from being a caregiver. You get a lot from being an advocate of somebody with a disability. They give a lot to you as well. And so I don't think this needs to look normal. I don't think this needs to look like anybody else's college experience, but just dealing with those feelings of guilt or, you know, taking on some kind of sense of shame that doesn't really belong to the relationship out of feelings of grief, really, or whatever kind of complexity. Like that's something, as a therapist, there's lots of ways of working with that, but just to like validate that like these feelings exist, and you are deserving of the opportunities you have, and your sibling doesn't want you to have less opportunities, and their opportunities are going to look different, and their life is just as worth living as yours. So, you know, I think there's a social narrative to deconstruct around that can really lighten people's hearts around these issues.
I love that. I love that.
Do you know, subhanAllah, I just had an image in my mind of Musa alayhi salam. You talked about older brother, little brother. Musa alayhi salam, you know, walking through the desert, sees a light in the distance, and he's given this commandment to go back to Fir'aun, and we hear the famous response of Prophet Musa, and he says, you know, oh Allah, expand for me my chest, Rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri, oh Allah, make easy for me my affairs, wahlul uqdatan min lisani, and oh Allah, loosen the tying of my tongue. Musa alayhi salam had a speech impediment, and so it was difficult for him to speak, and this was kind of a physical disability that Musa alayhi salam had. And so after mentioning that, he says, وَاجْعَلْ لِي وَزِيرًا مِّنْ أَهْلِي, and he says, oh Allah, send with me my brother Harun, you know, as a source of comfort, as a source of reassurance, as a source of support. Oh Allah, if I'm going to go be facing this Pharaoh guy, then I want my brother with me by my side. وَاجْعَلْ لِي وَزِيرًا مِّنْ أَهْلِي هَارُونَ أَخِي, he's my brother. أُشْدُدْ بِهِ أَزْرِي, you know, tighten us together. Such a beautiful example of exactly what you both were speaking about, this idea of this sibling dynamic, and we all have this. This is not limited to, you know, just the reality of having someone with special needs versus not. We all are searching for that strength from someone else, but particularly for those who have, you know, disabilities or challenges, if you will, you'll find that they're leaning towards their sibling, and to see prophets doing that is just such a beautiful thing. I want to echo, when I saw the word normal, it really just stood out to me. And I was like, let's talk about this concept of normalcy for a second, and really revisit. If the question was, how can Aisha be a healthy college student? I say that would be a valid question. But how can Aisha be a normal college student? The definition of what a normal marriage looks like, a normal sibling relationship, a normal career. Really, if there's one thing I can tell you as a person who serves in a community, is that there is nothing and no one that is normal. Because all normal are these images that we create in our head about how things are supposed to look like. Give me one example of normalcy from the lives of the greatest of creation. You know, what part of it is normal? And actually, you know, I would say that if we wish to be extraordinary people, then we need to be ready to live extraordinary lives. Our lives will be far from what is normal. And we need to define to ourselves, what is the image of our life that we want our life to look like. And the first part about painting that image is really accepting the reality of who we are and who our families are. Then accepting that my, you know, family member, you know, and all of us, and forgive me for this, all of us face different types of disabilities. Some of us are spiritually disabled. Some of us might have mental challenges, have emotional struggles, right? So if we embrace all of those different parts of who we are and how we are, it becomes so much easier to paint a picture of what we hope and strive for our lives to look like, right? So embracing the quote unquote abnormalities of life, right? The unexpected changes of our lives is the first step to actually loving them and creating a new picture. Not a picture that some social construct drew for us of what our lives look. No, the picture of my life that I drew for myself with the people that I love, you know.
Yeah, I love that. I'm throwing normal out the window of my vocabulary too, like Sister Muslim. I'm going to take a page out of both your book and throw that word out. So we just have a quick question relating to this scenario as well that I'll share with you. How involved should siblings be with a child that has a disability? Should parents have an expectation that siblings will be caregivers when parents pass away? And will this expectation influence their sibling relationship?
Yeah, there's a should in there, right? And it's really hard to make any kind of generalizations. There's a lot of discourse in family science around what we call parentification of, usually it's the oldest sibling, or sometimes it's just the oldest girl, who becomes a parent because another parent is not doing their job, or another parent is just simply absent. And this is how that family functions and gets through a day, a life, a year. And so I don't think that, I mean, it's very highly pathologized in family science. We try to remove that role from children in family therapy because usually it's part of a formula for that child having mental health issues, because that's a responsibility that's too heavy for that particular developmental stage of their life. It creates like an anxiety for them. There's also like this thing of overcompensating, right? That sometimes children do when they have a sibling with a disability. Their parents push them not only to take care of that sibling, but to prove to the world that we're a good family. Like, you have to get straight A's, you have to be an all-star ball player, you know. And it's a heavy job for a sibling. And I think that it's better for the parents to sit with their own feelings of insecurity and anxiety and things like that, rather than to try to resolve them by pushing these roles onto one of their children who's typically developing. At the same time, yes, sometimes there is a role for this person to be their sibling's advocate and their sibling's caregiver at times, or their sibling's caregiver in the distant future as an adult. But I think that families need to be very careful about why that is, and then, like, is it because there's a parent checking out, or is it because there's an appropriate need? And then also how that gets conveyed to the child, at what age, in what way. That's a very sensitive issue, because it can be too much psychologically and emotionally for that typically developing child. It can cause them problems, and then the parents are really dealing with a lot more on their plate, and a much more complex issue to diffuse.
Thank you. So I think this was actually such a wonderful discussion, and I just got so much out of it. Unfortunately, we're a little bit over, so I'm just going to go ahead and start wrapping it up. I'm going to put up that resource screen one more time for anyone who wants to take a screenshot or jot down any of these services. These are really great services for anyone who's feeling that burnout or needs some counseling or support. Please reach out to any of these resources available. And here's the sources where we got our information from today. And just to wrap it up, I just want to thank everyone so much for joining our program. Thank you so much to the panelists. You guys have given us such a wealth of knowledge today. You've really given us good guidance and tips and advice on how to deal with a lot of these feelings that, as I can tell you, from the perspective of a caregiver, I've really gained a lot from you today. So inshallah, our audience has as well. It's been really a privilege to moderate for all of you today. And so thank you so much for joining us, and Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you all.